Miss Marple and the Crimson Bookmark. Chapter 1. A Quiet Afternoon in Rosehill. The village of Rosehill prided itself on being one of those places where nothing truly dreadful ever happened. It had its fair share of minor squabbles, garden hedge disputes, gossip about who had been seen in the baker's shop with whom, and the occasional flare-up at the parish council meetings. But murder, actual bloody murder, belonged in the yellowed pages of crime novels or in the headlines of the Daily Mail, not in their quiet lanes shaded by horse-chestnut trees. It was on an otherwise peaceful Thursday afternoon that Mrs. Ellery, the vicar's wife, first mentioned the bookmark. At the time, it seemed so trivial that no one paid much attention. She had come bustling into the post office, cheeks flushed from hurrying, a sheaf of letters clutched in her hand. "Odd thing," she remarked to Mrs. Pettigrew, who ran the counter. "I borrowed a book from the parish library and found a most peculiar slip tucked between the pages. A crimson bookmark. Silk rather fine. It seemed quite out of place, in an old copy of the Pilgrim's Progress." Mrs. Pettigrew, being the sort of woman who thrived on the smallest whiff of intrigue, arched her eyebrows with relish. And whose book was it, I wonder? One of the villagers, perhaps? People are always slipping things inside, then forgetting about them. Mrs. Ellery gave a little laugh and smoothed her gloves. "Well, I suppose it's nothing. Only, strange that it had a faint mark upon it, as though it had been stained. Ink, perhaps. Or, well, never mind." Her words were quickly forgotten in the flurry of conversation about the upcoming harvest fete. But for one person in the room, they lingered quietly in the mind. Miss Jane Marple, sitting in the corner with her parcel of knitting wool, lifted her blue eyes from her knitting and made a small mental note. To most, the idea of a bookmark in a borrowed book was nothing at all. But Miss Marple had lived long enough to know that the smallest, most seemingly inconsequential things often became threads that, when followed carefully, unraveled the neat disguises behind human nature. Later that same day, the peace of Rosehill was broken. It was young Thomas Bradbury, the paper boy, who found the body. He had cycled up to the Greenfield house at the far end of Mill Lane, intending to deliver the Evening Chronicle. Instead, he had returned to the village in a state of high agitation, pale as milk and stammering about Mr. Leonard Greenfield lying quite still and not moving in the study. Within the hour, half the village had heard the news. By tea-time, the Greenfield home was swarming with a local constable, a doctor summoned from Marleycombe, and a gathering of villagers who, though professing shock and sorrow, were already whispering theories in lowered voices. "Heart attack, no doubt," muttered Mr. Pettigrew at the inn. "Or perhaps an accident. Leonard always did enjoy his whiskey a little too much," replied another. But when Dr. Reeves emerged from the house at dusk, his face unusually grave, the whispering sharpened into gasps. "It is not natural causes," he said quietly. "Mr. Greenfield was poisoned." And just like that, Rosehill changed forever. Miss Marple, who had been watching events unfold with her customary calm from the edge of the Greenfield's garden wall, folded her hands upon her walking stick. Her eyes lingered, not upon the excited crowd, nor upon the white-faced maid who wrung her apron at the door, but upon a small detail, just visible through the open study window. A book lay upon the desk where Mr. Greenfield had collapsed. Its pages splayed wide, and within it, almost glowing in the fading light of evening, rested something thin, silken, and unmistakably crimson. The bookmark had returned. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Parlor. The next morning dawned with an unnatural stillness over Rosehill, as though the village itself were holding its breath. The news of Leonard Greenfield's death had spread like ripples on a pond. By the time the church clock chimed 9, every household had heard the word poison at least twice, and added their own embroidered version of events. At Mrs. Hargreaves' tea shop, the parlor buzzed with voices. The scent of currant buns and strong Assam tea mingled with the sharp tang of speculation. "Well, if you ask me," declared Mrs. Pettigrew, thumping her teaspoon against her saucer for emphasis, "it's the wife we ought to look at first. They do say she never forgave him for that business about the gardener's daughter." "Rubbish," snapped Mrs. Ellery, though her eyes shone with curiosity. "Mrs. Greenfield may be cold, but she's not a poisoner. Leonard had enemies in business. Everyone knows his investments were failing." "And what about that secretary of his?" Another voice chimed in. Young, ambitious, always hovering around. A man like Greenfield would have made promises he couldn't keep. The theories grew wilder with each passing minute. Everyone had a story to tell, some memory of a quarrel, a look, a whispered word overheard at the post office. In the corner, knitting needles clicked steadily. Miss Marple sat with her customary quietness, her gaze soft, her ears sharper than anyone guessed. She rarely interrupted, only asked the smallest of questions. Questions that seemed harmless but guided the conversation like the hand of a careful gardener pruning roses. "And who," she murmured gently, "was it who last saw Mr. Greenfield alive?" A pause. Mrs. Hargreaves cleared her throat. "Why, his maid Edith, I believe. She took in his tray last evening. Said he was reading in his study." "Ah," Miss Marple said softly, fingers moving with delicate precision over her knitting. "And what was he reading, I wonder?" No one knew, of course. No one cared. But Miss Marple stored the answer away in her mind, just as she stored away 100 such trifles. By afternoon, the official presence arrived. Inspector Graves from Marleycombe, a square-shouldered man with a reputation for being methodical, entered the Greenfield home with a notebook and a certain air of finality. Inside the study, the curtains had been drawn against the bright September sun. The desk remained just as young Thomas had first seen it. Papers scattered, a glass half-drained of whiskey, and the book with its crimson bookmark lying open, accusatory, on the blotter. Graves frowned at it, but his attention soon returned to the whiskey glass. "Cyanide," he said grimly, consulting Dr. Reeves' report. "No question. Slipped in after the bottle was opened. A clear case of murder." Mrs. Greenfield, pale as alabaster in her black dress, insisted through trembling lips that she had not touched the whiskey. Edith, the maid, sobbed that she had only dusted the desk. The secretary, Mr. Collins, protested indignantly that he had left early that evening and could prove it. Each denial only added fuel to the village fires. And in the corner of the crowded study, Miss Marple's eyes lingered once more on the crimson bookmark. So innocent in appearance. And yet, she had once known a woman who concealed letters inside in books, marking her place with a ribbon. That ribbon had told the truth long before her words had. And Miss Marple, with her quiet certainty, felt that this silken marker might be the thread that would unravel the whole. Chapter 3. The Inspector's Suspect. Inspector Graves had a habit of speaking with clipped authority, as though every word he uttered was final. By the end of his first full day in Rosehill, he had already announced, at least to the sergeant and to Dr. Reeves, that he had a likely candidate. "The secretary," Graves declared, snapping his notebook shut in Mr. Greenfield's study. "Collins. Young fellow with debts, ambition, and access to both the whiskey and the desk. Fits neatly." Dr. Reeves, who had been examining the late Mr. Greenfield's papers for any mention of medicines, gave a doubtful murmur. Perhaps too neatly. But Graves did not hear. He was already marching to the parlor, where the suspects were gathered as though for some grotesque afternoon tea. Mrs. Greenfield sat rigid in her chair, her lace handkerchief crushed in her hand. Edith, the maid, sniffled into her apron. Mr. Collins, tall and nervy, stood at the window with his hands thrust into his pockets. "Mr. Collins," Graves barked, "you claim to have left this house by 6:30 yesterday evening." "Yes, Inspector," Collins replied. His voice was firm, but there was a tightness about the mouth. "I went straight to the stationer's in Marleycombe. Bought ink and paper. I still have the receipt." Graves allowed himself a thin smile. "A receipt proves a purchase, not the hour you made it. You could have slipped back here unseen." Collins flushed. "I did not poison Mr. Greenfield." From her seat in the corner, Miss Marple observed silently. The inspector's questions were brisk, pointed. They struck at opportunity and motive, but not at character. And to Miss Marple, character was the soil from which all crime grew. After the interview, as the suspects dispersed, she approached Inspector Graves with her gentle air of deference. "Forgive me, Inspector," she said, her voice soft as ever, "but you are very certain about Mr. Collins. I do wonder. Have you considered how very tidy the explanation sounds?" Graves frowned down at her. "The simplest explanation is usually the correct one, madam." Miss Marple smiled faintly. So it often appears. But human beings, Inspector, are rarely simple. Their little habits, their vanities, their grudges, they tangle things in the most curious ways. One might almost say that the truth is usually untidy. The inspector gave a non-committal grunt. To him, Miss Marple was nothing more than a fragile old lady with too much interest in other people's affairs. Yet later, as she walked home through the twilight, Miss Marple's thoughts turned not to Collins but to the bookmark. That silken strip of crimson had not been there by chance. She was certain of it. And as she turned into her cottage lane, she remembered, with perfect clarity, something she had overheard in Mrs. Hargreaves' shop only a week earlier. Mr. Greenfield speaking in a low, annoyed voice to someone unseen. "If you dare bring that matter up again, I'll burn the evidence myself." Evidence. A bookmark. A man who ended in poison. Yes, Miss Marple thought quietly, as the lamps flickered to life across the village, this was going to be very untidy indeed. Chapter 4. Gossip by Lamplight. By the evening following the murder, Rosehill had become a hive of speculation. Curtains twitched along the high street. Doors opened to admit neighbors who arrived ostensibly to borrow sugar or a newspaper but who lingered far too long over whispers. Every drawing-room lamp seemed to glow late into the night, illuminating faces leaning forward with conspiratorial eagerness. At Mrs. Ellery's vicarage, a small circle had gathered. The vicar's wife, bustling with excitement, had set out a tray of seed cake and tea, though little of it was touched. "It will be Collins, you'll see," she declared confidently, as though the inspector's words were already verdict. Men like him, too clever by half, and never content with their station. "I always said there was something shifty about his eyes." Mrs. Pettigrew, perched like a plump sparrow on the edge of her chair, countered. "Ah, but you forget Mrs. Greenfield. She was never happy, poor soul. Cold marriage, all those whispers about her husband's indiscretions. What if she finally had enough?" "Don't be absurd," said Mr. Ellery, though he spoke more out of duty than conviction. "Women of her class do not do such things." "Don't they?" murmured Miss Marple quietly, her knitting resting on her lap. The room stilled for a moment. Miss Marple's voice was soft, but it carried weight. She did not elaborate, nor did she meet anyone's gaze, yet somehow her simple question made the company uneasy. Later that night, as Miss Marple walked home beneath the rustling elm trees, she reflected on the fragments she had gathered. None were decisive, but they pricked at her mind like pins in a pincushion. Mrs. Greenfield's trembling composure, Collins' angry flush, the maid's frightened eyes. And always the crimson bookmark. Too fine, too deliberate, too out of place. The next morning brought fresh fuel for gossip. Edith, the maid, had confided to her cousin, who promptly confided to Mrs. Pettigrew, that Mr. Greenfield had received a letter only the day before his death. A letter, Edith claimed, that he had read with a face like thunder. A letter, Mrs. Pettigrew exclaimed, retelling the story in the shop queue. And torn up straight after. What do you suppose was in it? By noon, half the village believed the letter had been from a blackmailer. By supper, the other half were certain it had been from a woman. Miss Marple, for her part, made no contribution to the rumor mill. But in the quiet of her cottage, she considered the significance of a crimson bookmark and a letter destroyed. Words hidden, words erased, and a token left behind. Murder, she thought, is very often about words, spoken, written, or silenced forever. And she knew, deep in her bones, that somewhere in Rosehill, someone had spoken words they now regretted. Chapter 5. The Letter That Vanished. Inspector Graves returned to the Greenfield home the following morning with the brisk air of a man who believed himself already near the solution. He strode into the study, barked orders at the constable, and demanded a thorough search of all drawers, cabinets, and wastebaskets. It was during this search that the matter of the letter arose. Edith, the maid, wrung her hands as she confessed to the inspector what she had told her cousin the day before. "I saw him, sir," she stammered, eyes wide. "He read it by the window, his face dark as a storm. Then he tore it to bits, tiny bits, and dropped them into the fire. But I remember. There was a crimson edge to the paper, just at the top. Like a border, sir. I noticed it because it matched that bookmark of his." The inspector's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. "A quarrel, then?" Someone threatened him, he destroyed the letter, and later that night, poison. Neat as a pin. Miss Marple, who had been allowed inside on the courtesy of being a family acquaintance, and perhaps because no one quite dared to deny her, tilted her head at the maid. "My dear," she asked kindly, "are you sure about the crimson edge? You did not mistake a shadow, or a ribbon tucked between the pages?" Edith shook her head. "No, ma'am. Crimson, I'm certain." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Ah, then that is most interesting indeed." Later, as she walked slowly back along Mill Lane, Miss Marple turned the matter over in her mind. A crimson bookmark in a book. A letter edged in crimson, torn and destroyed. Two separate things, or one and the same. People so often thought they were clever when hiding their traces, but they betrayed themselves with their little flourishes, their vanities. She had once known a young curate who thought no one would recognize his handwriting if he wrote in block capitals, yet his peculiar way of dotting his I had given him away instantly. At that very moment, across the village, gossip was taking on a sharper edge. Mr. Collins had been seen arguing with Leonard Greenfield only a week ago about a sum of money. Mrs. Greenfield had been overheard telling a friend that she could not endure another winter under this roof, and someone, no one was quite sure who, whispered that Greenfield had been receiving anonymous notes for months. By evening, suspicion had hardened into certainty in the minds of many. Some were convinced of Collins' guilt, others of Mrs. Greenfield's, and still others spoke darkly of an outside hand. Miss Marple, sitting quietly with her knitting, knew better. Certainty so early was the surest sign of blindness. The truth, she felt, lay not in the loud accusations, but in the quiet crimson thread that linked a torn letter and a silken bookmark. And she intended to follow that thread, patiently, quietly, until it revealed what it was meant to conceal. Chapter 6. The Inspector's Net. Inspector Graves wasted little time. By Saturday afternoon, he had summoned Mr. Collins to the station in Marleycombe for further questioning. The village received the news with a collective shiver of satisfaction. Nothing comforted gossip like the naming of a suspect. "Of course it's Collins," Mrs. Pettigrew said triumphantly in the grocer's queue. "I told you from the first. He has the look of a guilty man. Thin lips. Nervous hands. Always tapping his pocket as though hiding something." Mrs. Ellery pursed her lips. "But receipts, dear. He had that receipt from Marleycombe. Forged, naturally. That sort always knows how to make things appear respectable." In the corner of the shop, Miss Marple pretended to be comparing tins of golden syrup, though her ears caught every word. She had no doubt Collins had something to hide. Most men of his temperament did. But whether it was murder, that she doubted. At the police station, Inspector Graves pressed Collins with question after question. Why had he quarreled with Mr. Greenfield over money? Why had he lingered about the study on Tuesday evening? Why had Edith, the maid, seen him return later than he claimed? Collins grew flushed and stammered, his indignation mounting with every accusation. At last he burst out. "Yes, I argued with him. Yes, I was desperate for funds. But I did not kill him. I left this house before he poured his whiskey. Long before. If you would only look at his business papers, you would see he was ruined. He had enemies far greater than a secretary with debts." Graves leaned back, unimpressed. To him, this was merely the frantic flailing of a guilty man. Meanwhile, Miss Marple walked the garden path behind the Greenfield home. Her eyes, sharper than most credited, scanned the borders where chrysanthemums stood in neat rows. She paused, stooped, and lifted something from the soil. A small scrap of paper, half buried, damp from last night's rain. Only a corner survived, but upon it gleamed a narrow strip of crimson. Miss Marple held it between her fingers, her expression unreadable. When she returned it quietly to her reticule, she thought not of Collins, nor of Mrs. Greenfield, nor even of the inspector's questions. She thought of the peculiar way human beings attempted to destroy what incriminated them. They always forgot one piece. And this piece, she suspected, would prove very troublesome indeed. Chapter 7. A Widow's Silence. On Sunday morning, the bells of St. Michael's rang across Rosehill, calling the faithful to service. Yet the pew where Leonard Greenfield had so often sat with his wife was conspicuously empty. Mrs. Greenfield had pleaded illness, choosing instead to remain shuttered in her drawing room. This, naturally, only deepened the village's suspicions. "Guilt, that's what it is," muttered Mr. Hargreaves to his neighbor as they left the church. "Too ashamed to show her face." "Or frightened," the neighbor replied gravely. "Women know when a noose is tightening." Miss Marple, walking home at her gentle pace, neither agreed nor disagreed. She had learned long ago that villagers spoke more of themselves than of others when they gossiped. Still, she noted the change in Mrs. Greenfield's behavior. Silence could be a shield, but it could also be an admission. That afternoon, determined to offer what she called a little Christian kindness, Miss Marple paid a visit to the widow. She was received by Edith, who looked harried and red-eyed, and shown into a dimly lit parlor. Mrs. Greenfield sat upright on the sofa, her figure elegant even in morning black. Her face was pale, her eyes ringed with sleeplessness, but there was a steadiness in her manner that suggested steel beneath the fragility. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice low, "I know why you've come. The whole village is whispering. Let them. I will not defend myself against idle tongues." Miss Marple settled into a chair, her knitting bag at her side. "My dear, tongues will wag whether you protest or not. But sometimes silence gives them more to wag about." Mrs. Greenfield gave a faint, humorless smile. "I imagine nothing I say would satisfy them. Leonard was not beloved, Miss Marple. You know that as well as I." Miss Marple inclined her head. "I do. But I also know that a man unloved may still be mourned honestly, or not at all. And that makes all the difference." There was a silence. Mrs. Greenfield's hand trembled as she reached for a glass of water. Then, almost in a whisper, she said, "He had secrets, Miss Marple. Affairs, investments, promises he never kept. That bookmark you ask about, it was mine once. He used it mockingly, as if to remind me of what I had lost." "Lost?" Miss Marple asked gently. But Mrs. Greenfield pressed her lips together and shook her head. "No more. Not now. The inspector will make his inquiries, and I will endure them. That is all I will say." When Miss Marple left the house, the September sky was darkening into a heavy dusk. She walked slowly, her mind alive with possibilities. A widow's silence, a bookmark once belonging to her, a torn crimson-edged letter, and a man poisoned in his own study. It was, she reflected, very much like one of those intricate samplers she used to embroider as a girl, threads crossing and tangling until the pattern was invisible. But if one tugged at the right thread, the whole design would emerge. And she had the uneasy feeling that the thread in this case ran straight through the heart of Mrs. Greenfield's silence. Chapter 8. A Most Unexpected Will. Monday morning brought an air of unease to Rosehill. The inspector had tightened his grip on Mr. Collins. The village continued to whisper about Mrs. Greenfield, and yet, quietly, beneath all this, another revelation came to light. Mr. Swithin, the elderly solicitor from Marleycombe, arrived at the Greenfield home carrying a leather briefcase and his habitual air of discreet importance. After a hushed conversation with the inspector, he announced that Leonard Greenfield's last will and testament was to be examined immediately. The reading took place in the study, the very room where Greenfield had died. The widow, pale and composed, sat stiff-backed in her chair. Mr. Collins was brought in under the inspector's stern watch. Edith hovered in the doorway, her apron wrung into a knot. Miss Marple, who had a way of being invited where others might not, sat quietly in a corner, her knitting bag at her feet. Mr. Swithin unfolded the document with deliberate care. "It is a very recent will," he said, peering over his spectacles. "Dated only a fortnight ago." At this, Mrs. Greenfield started slightly. The solicitor read aloud. Greenfield had left the bulk of his estate, house, investments, and land, not to his wife as expected, but to one Mr. Harold Denning, a name that fell into the room like a stone into a pond. "Denning," repeated Inspector Graves sharply. "Who is this Denning?" Mr. Swithin cleared his throat. "An acquaintance of Mr. Greenfield's, from his time in London. I have no further details." Mrs. Greenfield's hands tightened on the arms of her chair. "Harold Denning," she said faintly. "So it comes to light at last." Miss Marple, watching her, caught the quick flush in the widow's cheeks, the tremor of her voice. There was history there, old history best left buried. But Leonard Greenfield, it seemed, had seen fit to dig it up with his will. The inspector wasted no time. This Denning must be found. A new heir, a sudden change in fortune, and the death of the man who signed it? It stinks of conspiracy. That evening, as the news spread through Rosehill, the gossip took on new life. No longer was Mrs. Greenfield at the center of every whispered theory. Now people asked, "Who is Harold Denning? Where did he come from? And why should Leonard Greenfield cut off his own wife for the sake of a stranger?" Miss Marple sat quietly in her parlor, the lamplight soft on her neat rows of knitting. She was not at all surprised by the existence of a will that unsettled everything. In her experience, wills were like Pandora's boxes. Once opened, they released all manner of spite, jealousy, and greed. But what interested her most was not who had gained, but who had known of the change. For murder, she thought, so often bloomed not from the promise of fortune, but from the fear of loss. And she wondered, as she threaded her needle with fresh yarn, just how many in Rosehill had already heard the name Harold Denning whispered in darker corners, long before the solicitor spoke it aloud. Chapter 9. Cracks in the Case. Inspector Graves was not a man who enjoyed complications. His method was to fix upon a likely suspect and then build his case brick by brick until the wall stood firm. But Harold Denning's sudden appearance in the will knocked a large hole in his carefully constructed wall. "Blast it," he muttered, slamming his notebook shut as he left the solicitor's office. "If Denning stands to inherit, then half the village will think he arranged the poisoning. And I've not even laid eyes on the fellow." Back in Rosehill, the gossip had shifted overnight. Mr. Collins was spoken of less often, and the mysterious Mr. Denning was on everyone's tongue. Some said he was a business partner. Others swore he had been a rival for Mrs. Greenfield's affections many years ago. One rumor insisted he was not a man at all but an alias, invented for some sordid purpose. Miss Marple listened, smiled, and said very little. Yet as she sat in Mrs. Hargreaves' tea shop, her needles clicking softly, she caught a curious remark from Edith the maid, who had slipped in for a hurried cup of cocoa. "It's not fair," Edith muttered to the woman beside her. "All this talk of Mr. Denning when the truth is in that study. I told them about the letter. They don't listen." Miss Marple glanced up from her knitting. "You are quite right, my dear. Men in authority rarely listen to those they think unimportant. But it does not mean you are wrong." Edith blinked at her, then nodded mutely before hurrying off. Later that day, Miss Marple took a slow walk past the Greenfield home. She paused by the garden gate, stooping as though to admire a cluster of Michaelmas daisies. What she was really examining was the earth beneath them. The scrap of crimson paper she had discovered 2 days earlier had not been alone. Now, with careful fingers, she found another, smaller, damp, nearly dissolved, but still marked with a faint trace of handwriting. Only a fragment of a word survived. Betrayal. Miss Marple slipped it into her reticule and continued on her way, her expression mild, almost vacant. But within, her thoughts were quick and sure. If Leonard Greenfield had received such a letter, and if it bore the same crimson edge as the bookmark, then the bookmark was no mere ornament at all. It was a clue deliberately placed, or perhaps overlooked by a careless hand. Meanwhile, Inspector Graves was doubling down. He summoned Mrs. Greenfield to the station that evening. His tone was sharp, his questions blunt. "You must have known of this will," he accused. "You must have had a quarrel with your husband over it." Mrs. Greenfield lifted her chin, her eyes bright with anger. "I knew nothing of that document, Inspector. But even if I had, do you think I would stoop to poison? My husband was cruel, yes, but he was also a coward. If he wished to hurt me, he could do so in life without the need of a will." Graves was unmoved. To him, anger was as good as guilt. But Miss Marple, who heard the account later from Mrs. Ellery, shook her head softly. "No, no," she murmured. "Anger may come from innocence as easily as guilt. It is fear, Inspector, that unmasks a murderer. And we have not yet seen who is afraid." Chapter 10. The Stranger Arrives. The morning train from London screeched into Rosehill Station with a metallic groan that seemed to echo through the quiet village. It was rare for outsiders to step off at this platform, rarer still for them to do so with an air of confidence that suggested they belonged. Harold Denning did exactly that. He was a tall man in his early 50s, with dark, neatly combed hair that showed only the faintest strands of gray. His suit was well cut, his shoes polished, and his eyes, sharp and restless, moved over the platform as if cataloging everything and everyone in sight. Several villagers had gathered under the pretext of waiting for parcels, but in truth, they wanted to see him. Whispers fluttered through the crowd like sparrows. "That's him, Greenfield's heir. Looks more like a banker than a relative. Did you see the way he carries himself? Not grieving at all." Denning gave no sign of hearing them. He handed a porter his valise and walked with purposeful strides toward the waiting carriage sent by the solicitor. Miss Marple, who had chosen a seat on the station bench that morning for her knitting, looked up mildly as he passed. Their eyes met briefly. His narrowed, assessing. Hers remained soft, unreadable. Curious, she thought as her needles clicked. Not the step of a man uncertain of his welcome. More the step of one who has come to claim what he believes is his. By noon, the entire village buzzed with the news. Denning had gone straight to the Greenfield residence. He was seen entering the study with Mrs. Greenfield and the solicitor. The curtains remained drawn for nearly 2 hours, and when they reopened, Mrs. Greenfield's face was pale, her lips tight. Inspector Graves wasted no time. He called Denning to the station for questioning that same afternoon. "You were close to the deceased?" Graves began brusquely. Denning leaned back in the chair, crossing one leg over the other. "Close. Not in affection, Inspector. But in business, yes. Greenfield owed me a good deal more than money. He owed me, let us call it honesty. I am here to ensure certain matters are not conveniently forgotten." The inspector scowled. "You're aware you stand to inherit?" "Entirely. And I intend to see that inheritance secured. You may suspect me if you wish. But if I had poisoned Greenfield, do you think I would walk into this village openly, instead of arranging matters from a safe distance?" It was a clever point, and Graves did not like clever points when they came from suspects. Later, as Denning left the station, he encountered Miss Marple by the churchyard gate. She seemed to be tying up a loose strand of ivy that had come away from the wall. "A sad business," she murmured as though to no one in particular. Denning paused. "Sad, yes. But inevitable, perhaps." He gave her a curt nod and moved on. Miss Marple watched him go. She had seen the flicker of something in his expression. Not grief, not triumph, but a shadow of unease. For all his composure, Harold Denning was a man carrying a burden. And burdens, Miss Marple knew, had a way of revealing themselves in time. Chapter 11. A Cry in the Night. Rosehill slept early, its cottages dark and silent well before midnight. But on that damp September night, the peace was broken. A scream, high, sharp, unmistakably female, cut through the mist. It came from the direction of the Greenfield residence. Within moments, lamps were flickering to life all along the high street. Doors creaked open, and dressing gowns were hastily pulled around shoulders. Mr. Pritchard, the grocer, swore he saw a figure running from the back of the Greenfield garden. Tall, in dark clothing, he told the small crowd that gathered, and moving quick as a fox. When Inspector Graves arrived, grumbling at being roused from bed, he found Mrs. Greenfield pale and trembling in the front hall. "It was in the study," she gasped. "A shadow at the window. And then, oh, I cannot bear to think of it." The study bore signs of disturbance. Drawers pulled half open, papers strewn across the carpet. Most curious of all was a book lying open upon the desk, one of Greenfield's cherished volumes. Between its pages rested yet another Crimson Bookmark, this one folded, torn, and damp as though handled in haste. "Blast it," Graves muttered, holding the fragment between his fingers. "What game is this? Who keeps planting these things?" Harold Denning, summoned from the Rosehill Arms where he was lodging, arrived soon after. He looked grave but not surprised. "Someone is searching for something," he said quietly. Perhaps your murderer left behind more than he intended. Graves eyed him narrowly. Convenient theory, Mr. Denning. Almost as if you knew what they were looking for. Denning did not rise to the bait. Instead, his gaze flicked to Miss Marple, who stood in the corner near the bookshelves. She was not watching Graves nor Denning, but the scattered papers at her feet. Her handkerchief fluttered once, twice, as though she were brushing away a speck of dust. In reality, she had spotted a corner of paper, half hidden beneath the rug, overlooked in the inspector's irritation. When no one was watching, she bent with apparent effort to steady herself on the arm of a chair, and her fingers closed gently over the slip. It joined the earlier fragments in her reticule. By dawn, the gossip was fierce. Some said Denning had staged the scene to deflect suspicion. Others insisted Mrs. Greenfield herself had cried out in a fit of guilt. A few claimed it was no human at all, but the ghost of Leonard Greenfield seeking justice. Miss Marple, sipping her morning tea with Mrs. Ellery, listened to it all. She said nothing of the note now tucked safely in her sewing basket. But her eyes, kind and wise, held a quiet certainty. The pieces were beginning to fit. And if the murderer was growing reckless, then the truth was drawing nearer. Chapter 12. Tea and Fragments. The autumn rain fell steadily over Rosehill, tapping at windows and turning the lanes into streams of glistening mud. Yet inside Mrs. Ellery's sitting room, a warm fire blazed, the scent of currant buns filled the air, and Miss Marple sat with her knitting on her lap, the firelight softening her already gentle expression. The tea-table was crowded that afternoon. Mrs. Ellery, naturally, along with Mrs. Price from the post office, young Mr. Collins, eager to defend his name, still whispered about, and Edith the maid, who had timidly accepted an invitation. Villagers gathered here as moths to a flame, drawn by warmth, tea, and the irresistible chance to share what they knew, or thought they knew. It was, in Miss Marple's mind, the perfect arrangement. Mrs. Price leaned forward, her voice low though everyone could hear. Mark my words, it was Denning. He comes down from London, bold as brass, and within days there's another disturbance. I never trust a man who won't look you straight in the eye. Young Collins flushed. If anyone's to blame, it's not him. I heard from the station master that Denning's been asking questions about Greenfield's accounts. Sounds more like business than murder to me. Business can be murder, Mrs. Ellery said gravely, nodding toward Miss Marple as though for confirmation. Miss Marple smiled, her needles clicking softly. Murder, my dear, seldom arises from the grand designs people like to imagine. More often it is quite ordinary. Envy, fear, love gone sour, or some small grievance allowed to fester. A business account may be the stage, but it is rarely the true motive. Edith, who had been silent until now, suddenly burst out. But what about the letters? He had letters in his desk. I saw him reading one the very day before he died. A crimson edge it had, like those scraps the inspector keeps finding. The room fell quiet. Miss Marple looked up mildly. And you are certain of this, Edith? The maid nodded vigorously. Certain as the church clock. He crumpled it, then smoothed it out again, muttering something fierce. I only caught a word, betrayal. Then he shoved it in the drawer. Mrs. Price gasped. Mrs. Ellery tooted. But Miss Marple's face remained serene as her hands folded the yarn neatly. When the others had left, she drew Edith gently aside. You did very well, my dear. Truth is a shy creature. It takes courage to speak of what one has seen. You may have noticed more than you think. That evening, in the quiet of her own cottage, Miss Marple laid out the fragments she had gathered. Faded paper, damp edges, ink blurred but legible in parts. Together, the slips suggested more than coincidence. She read them softly, piecing words aloud. Betrayal. Owe you. Final chance. Her eyes narrowed just slightly. It was not the hand of an anonymous blackmailer. No, this was the voice of someone close, someone who believed themselves wronged. She folded the scraps away, her mind already weaving the threads into a pattern. The Crimson Bookmark was no decorative trifle. It was the signal of a correspondence that someone was desperate to recover, or destroy. And in Miss Marple's experience, desperation was the truest scent of guilt. Chapter 13. An uneasy conversation. The following afternoon was brisk and bright after the long rain. Miss Marple chose her moment carefully. She had heard, through Mrs. Price of the post office, that Harold Denning had taken a room at the Rosehill Arms and often sat in its lounge between 4 and 5, reading the papers with a glass of sherry at his elbow. At precisely 4:30, Miss Marple entered the lounge. The room smelled faintly of tobacco and polish. A fire burned low, and Denning sat alone by the window, the Times folded neatly upon his knee. "Mr. Denning," she said pleasantly, pausing as though uncertain whether to intrude. He rose at once, polite if wary. "Miss Marple, is it? The lady detective I keep hearing about." His smile did not reach his eyes. "Oh no," she said with her usual modesty. "I am nothing of the kind. Just an old woman who observes a little here and there. May I?" She gestured toward the empty chair. He inclined his head. "Of course." They sat. For a time she busied herself with her knitting, the needles clicking a steady rhythm that seemed to unnerve him more than words. Finally she spoke softly. "You were a friend of Mr. Greenfield's." His jaw tightened. "Once, perhaps. We went into business together. He prospered. I did not." Miss Marple nodded, as if that explained everything. It must be difficult, seeing one's own fortune slip into another man's pocket. He gave a short laugh. "You're blunt for a village lady. Age excuses many things, Mr. Denning. It also teaches one that most quarrels among men spring from money, or love." She looked up at him mildly. "Which was it, in your case?" For a moment, his composure cracked. A shadow passed over his face, and he looked away toward the fire. "Perhaps both," he admitted at last. "Greenfield and I, we shared more than accounts. We shared friendships, even affections. He betrayed them. That is all I will say." Miss Marple's needles paused, just briefly, before resuming. Betrayal is a heavy word. It is the kind of word one uses in letters, not merely in conversation. Denning's head snapped round, his eyes narrowing. "What do you mean by that?" "Oh, nothing," she said lightly, tucking her knitting into her bag. "Only that when a person feels betrayed, he often leaves traces, in ink on paper, in careless words spoken when the heart is sore. Such things have a way of resurfacing, however one might wish otherwise." He studied her with a mixture of suspicion and unease. "You seem to know a good deal, Miss Marple." "Only what people tell me," she said serenely, rising to her feet. "And people always tell one more than they intend." As she left the lounge, Miss Marple knew she had accomplished her aim. Denning was rattled. He had confirmed, without meaning to, that the crimson notes were his, born of anger, written in haste, and now returning to haunt him. But whether that anger had driven him to murder, that, she thought, remained to be seen. Chapter 14. The Garden at the Vicarage. The vicarage garden was, at that time of year, a study in autumnal neglect. Fallen leaves lay thick upon the paths, and the last roses hung withered on their stems. Reverend Ellery, ever distracted by his sermons, left such matters to his gardener, who, being laid up with a bad back, had not touched a rake in weeks. It was Mrs. Ellery who discovered the thing. Out walking in the late afternoon, she bent to gather a handful of marigolds before the frost claimed them. Her hand brushed something hard in the soil, half buried beneath the ivy near the garden wall. At first she thought it a child's toy, but when she drew it free, the truth sent a chill up her spine. A small glass vial, its stopper missing, its inside rim faintly stained. Within the hour, Inspector Graves was summoned, stomping irritably into the vicarage with mud still clinging to his boots. He turned the vial over in his hands and sniffed. "Poison," he declared. "Mark me, this is our murder weapon. And buried here, of all places." The Reverend was stricken. "But, Inspector, surely you don't believe." "I believe," Graves said grimly, "that whoever placed this here wanted to cast suspicion away from themselves, or perhaps to draw it upon another. Either way, it speaks of calculation." By the following morning, the whole village knew of the discovery. Tongues wagged furiously. Why, it could have been Mrs. Ellery herself, or the Reverend. Perhaps he envied Greenfield's influence. No, no. Too simple. It was planted there. Mark my words, it was Denning again. Miss Marple, listening at her gate while Mrs. Price delivered these pronouncements, only smiled faintly. Later, she walked down to the vicarage to see the spot for herself. The earth was freshly disturbed, too neatly covered as though someone had been careful, but not careful enough. More interesting still was the strand of wool snagged on the ivy. Crimson, frayed, unmistakable. She plucked it delicately and tucked it into her reticule with the paper fragments. That evening, over tea, she murmured to Mrs. Ellery, "One learns much from gardens. Things meant to be hidden have a way of coming up again, like bulbs in spring. And I have always found, my dear, that murderers are poor gardeners. They bury in haste, and nature betrays them." Mrs. Ellery shivered. "Do you mean you know who?" "Oh no," Miss Marple said mildly, her eyes kind but thoughtful. "Not yet. But I know a little more of how it was done. And that," she added, "is the beginning." Chapter 15. Accusations at the Arms. The Rosehill Arms was rarely lively, but on that particular evening it fairly hummed with talk. The villagers, restless after the discovery of the poison vial, had chosen the inn's common room as the place to air their theories. Ale was poured freely, and whispers turned into bold declarations. When Harold Denning entered, the chatter dipped into silence. All eyes turned. He paused only a moment before walking to the hearth with his usual confidence, though his jaw was set a shade too tightly. It was Mrs. Price, emboldened by her companions, who spoke first. "You might as well admit it, Mr. Denning. That vial at the vicarage. Who else would it be but you? You with your fancy inheritance and your London airs." A murmur of agreement ran through the room. Denning's gaze swept across them, cool and steady. "I see the village thrives on suspicion more than truth. If I were guilty, Mrs. Price, would I remain here in plain sight, inviting your accusations?" From a corner table, young Collins blurted, "Because you've nothing to fear if you've hidden your tracks well enough." His voice cracked with the strain of defending himself from gossip that had once pointed at him. The tension snapped like a whip. Voices rose, accusations flew, and it took the innkeeper pounding the bar with his fist to restore order. It was then that Miss Marple, who had been sitting quietly with her teacup, lifted her eyes. Her voice was mild, but it carried clearly. "It is curious, is it not, how poison bottles and letters find their way into gardens and drawers? Curious, too, how such things appear when suspicions begin to waver. In my experience, when evidence comes to hand too conveniently, one must ask not who is guilty, but who is most eager to show guilt." The room fell silent again, every head turning toward her. Denning shifted, his expression unreadable. After a moment, he inclined his head. "Wise words, madam. Perhaps too wise for my comfort." He left soon after, his stride brisk, his shoulders rigid. But Miss Marple had not been speaking for him alone. She had noticed the flicker of unease in another face across the room. Small, quickly masked, but enough to catch her keen attention. And so, as the villagers resumed their clamor, Miss Marple sipped her tea with a serene smile. She had learned long ago that in chaos, the truth often peeks out. One only had to be patient enough to see it. Chapter 16. The Weight of Secrets. The air in Rosehill felt heavier after the discovery at the vicarage. People greeted one another with forced cheer, their eyes flicking nervously to see who might be listening. Every conversation seemed laced with suspicion. Inspector Graves, for his part, had seized on the vial as proof that Harold Denning was the culprit. Who else would have reason to hide the evidence? He growled at the Rosehill Arms, where Denning still lodged. A man with everything to gain and nothing to lose. Denning's composure, however, did not falter. "Inspector, if I wish to hide the vial, why would I choose the vicarage garden, a place walked daily by half the parish? No. Someone wanted it found, and found quickly. You may be clever in your bluster, but your murderer is cleverer still." The inspector bristled, but Denning's words, carried by Mrs. Price to every corner of the village, had their effect. Some began to wonder if the accusation was indeed too neat. Meanwhile, Miss Marple spent her afternoon in quieter pursuits. She sat in Mrs. Ellery's parlor, mending a pair of gloves, while Edith the maid dusted the mantelpiece. At length, Miss Marple said gently, "You mentioned once, Edith, that you saw Mr. Greenfield with a letter before his death. Do you recall how it was signed?" Edith hesitated. Her cloth paused mid-swipe. I think it ended with an initial. Just an H. But he tore it quickly, so I can't be sure." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "An H, you say? That is most helpful." Later that evening, in her own cottage, she laid out the evidence once more. The crimson scraps, the frayed wool, the vial, and now the memory of a letter signed with an H. Piece by piece, the pattern sharpened. It was not just Denning who had reason to be fearful. Others, too, had cause to tremble. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was young Collins, his face pale, his hands twisting his cap. "Miss Marple," he stammered. "They say the inspector's set to charge me next. He thinks I buried that bottle to throw blame elsewhere. I swear I didn't. You believe me, don't you?" She regarded him kindly, noting the desperate earnestness in his eyes. "Yes, my dear. I believe you." And indeed she did. For Miss Marple had long since learned the difference between the fear of guilt and the fear of being wrongly accused. But as she closed the door behind him, her gentle smile faded. Somewhere in Rosehill, someone truly guilty was growing desperate. And desperation, she knew, was a dangerous companion. It led to mistakes. Chapter 17. Firelight and Fear. It was near midnight when the alarm went up. A blaze, sudden and fierce, lit the sky from the direction of the Greenfield estate. Villagers poured into the lane, some in slippers and dressing gowns, others dragging buckets and blankets. The study window glowed red against the darkness, flames licking greedily at the curtains. Inspector Graves arrived panting, his helmet askew, shouting orders. "Water, form a line. Keep clear of the doors." By the time the fire was subdued, the study was a blackened ruin. The desk had collapsed in on itself, its drawers warped and smoldering. Papers had curled into ash, books fallen in charred heaps. Only one object remained curiously intact, a single crimson bookmark, half scorched at the edges, lying in plain sight upon the hearthrug. "Another one," Graves exclaimed, seizing it with his handkerchief. "The devil is mocking us." Harold Denning stood among the crowd, his face grim in the flickering light. "Or destroying what might have damned him," he said softly, though loud enough for several to hear. His eyes flicked to Mrs. Greenfield, who stood pale and trembling, clutching her shawl. Suspicion shifted like a tide. Some whispered it was Denning himself who had set the fire to obliterate the letters. Others muttered darkly about Mrs. Greenfield. Was she trying to rid herself of secrets before they were uncovered? Miss Marple, standing a little apart, studied the ruined room. Her eyes lingered not on the flames, but on the pattern of disturbance. The desk drawers all open, the hearthrug dragged half aside, the pile of half-burned correspondence. Too clumsy for a mere accident. Too theatrical for a desperate cover-up. Someone wanted them to see the fire. Someone wanted the destruction to look complete, while ensuring one small piece, the crimson bookmark, remained. The next morning, Rosehill buzzed with new fear. If the murderer was bold enough to set fires, what might come next? At Mrs. Ellery's tea table, Miss Marple listened quietly, her needles flashing in the lamplight. When at last the others had gone, she said softly, almost to herself, "Flames purify, but they also conceal. And in concealment, one sometimes betrays more than one intends." Her gaze fell upon the small folded scraps of crimson paper hidden in her sewing basket. Together with the charred bookmark, they whispered a truth not yet spoken aloud. Miss Marple's lips tightened, though her manner stayed mild. The murderer was pressing harder now, fearful, reckless. And that meant the endgame was drawing near. Chapter 18. The Quiet Snare. The fire at Greenfield House had left the village unsettled. Shopkeepers kept their shutters half closed, children were called home before dusk, and even the vicar's Sunday sermon seemed more about sin and secrecy than salvation. Through it all, Miss Marple went about her usual business, knitting by the fire, walking to the greengrocer's, pausing to inquire after Mrs. Ellery's arthritis. Yet behind the mild exterior, her mind was working tirelessly. She had begun, in her quiet way, to set little snares. At the post office, she made a remark about the fire. How curious it was that only the study burned, while the kitchen and library remained untouched. She mentioned it casually as though speaking of the weather, and watched the faces around her. Harold Denning frowned deeply, muttering that fires spread where they may. Mrs. Greenfield, however, blanched and dropped her purse, her hands trembling so violently that young Alice had to pick it up for her. Later, at tea with Mrs. Ellery, Miss Marple steered the talk to bookmarks, of all things. How they so often became keepsakes, pressed between the pages of old novels. People forget they've left something there, until years later it tells a story they'd rather keep hidden. The remark was idle enough, but she noted the stiffening of Edgar Blythe's posture as he sipped his tea, a flicker of alarm in his eyes. Interesting. That evening, Miss Marple took a further step. She visited Inspector Graves with a plate of seed cake, sitting primly in his cluttered office. "I thought perhaps," she said gently, "that a little patience might serve us better than force. People are seldom at their most honest when frightened. But if one gives them rope, they often entangle themselves." Graves, harried and tired, looked at her with some exasperation. "I can't sit about waiting for people to incriminate themselves, Miss Marple. We need evidence." "Oh, but you have more than you think," she replied, her blue eyes steady. "It is not the grand gestures that betray a guilty mind, but the small ones. A hand that trembles, a word spoken too quickly, a look that lingers where it should not." The inspector harumphed, but he knew from past experience that her quiet certainty often led somewhere useful. That night, as Miss Marple sat in her parlor, her knitting in her lap, she allowed herself the faintest of smiles. The village was stirring in just the way she hoped. Fear loosens tongues. Guilt betrays itself in haste. Sooner rather than later, the murderer would step fully into the open, thinking it a clever move, when in fact it was the snare tightening. And Miss Marple, patient as ever, would be there waiting. Chapter 19. A Slip of the Tongue. Market day dawned bright in Rosehill, though beneath the chatter of haggling and greetings ran a current of unease. The murder, the fire, the crimson bookmarks, all hung over the village like a storm cloud. Miss Marple moved slowly through the stalls, basket in hand, pausing to admire lettuces and nod to acquaintances. She was outwardly the picture of serenity, yet her eyes were sharp, noting every twitch of expression, every glance quickly averted. It was near the butcher's that she heard it. Edgar Blythe speaking to Mr. Corbett, his voice pitched lower than usual. "Of course, the letters are gone now. That fire saw to it." Corbett frowned. "Letters? Who said anything about letters?" There was a pause. Half a second, but enough. Blythe's face froze, then he forced a laugh. "Oh, just a manner of speaking. I meant books, papers, what have you." He paid quickly for his meat and strode off, leaving Corbett blinking after him. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked idly that afternoon in her parlor, but her mind was turning swiftly. The inspector had never spoken publicly of letters being destroyed in the fire. Only someone with inside knowledge, or the culprit, could have known. Later, at Mrs. Ellery's tea, the village gossip swirled with renewed vigor. "Mark my words," whispered Mrs. Price. "That man Blythe knows more than he lets on. He's forever scribbling in that ledger of his." Others chimed in, emboldened. Some said he had debts. Others muttered about an affair long ago with Mrs. Greenfield. Theories grew like ivy, twisting in every direction. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, allowed the talk to spin itself out. She contributed nothing, save a quiet. People do so often betray themselves when they speak too freely. That night, Edgar Blythe sat alone in his study, the lamplight harsh on his pale face. He opened a drawer and pulled out a small packet wrapped in brown paper. Inside, pressed between pages of an old book, lay scraps of crimson silk. His hands trembled as he stared at them. Outside, the village lay quiet, unaware that one man's slip of the tongue had shifted the balance of suspicion and brought Miss Marple closer to the truth. Chapter 20. Confrontation at dusk. The autumn evening fell swiftly over Rosehill, the air sharp with wood smoke. Villagers lingered on doorsteps, whispering of Edgar Blythe's blunder at the market. By the time the church bell tolled 7, Suspicion had hardened into something more dangerous: anger. A knot of men gathered outside the post office, muttering. "He as good as confessed," said Mr. Corbett, fists clenched. "Talking of letters no one else knew about. What more proof do we need?" Mrs. Ellery, wringing her hands, hurried to Miss Marple's cottage. "It's dreadful, Jane. They mean to march up to his house this very night. You must speak to them, calm them." Miss Marple, serene as always, laid aside her knitting. Mob justice never yet produced truth, only more harm. "But sometimes," she added softly, "the guilty do show their hand when pressed." By the time she arrived at Blythe's cottage, a crowd had gathered, their lanterns casting wild shadows. Blythe himself stood in the doorway, pale and sweating, protesting his innocence. "You've no proof, none. Leave me be." Inspector Graves shouldered his way through, barking for order. "Go home, the lot of you. This isn't a circus." But his voice struggled to carry over the din. It was Miss Marple's gentle tones that cut through. "Mr. Blythe," she said clearly, "if you truly have nothing to hide, then perhaps you would allow the inspector to search your study. That would settle matters, would it not?" The crowd hushed, waiting. Blythe's eyes darted left and right. His lips moved soundlessly before he stammered. No one is going into my study." The effect was immediate. A ripple of murmurs spread through the villagers. Even Graves stiffened, suspicion confirmed in his mind. "Then I must insist," the inspector said grimly. He stepped forward, pushing past Blythe's feeble attempt to bar the way. Inside the study, the truth, or part of it, was laid bare. In a locked drawer, beneath stacks of unpaid bills, lay a bundle of correspondence tied with faded ribbon. The letters were scorched at the edges, but still legible. And tucked within the pages of one, like a grim signature, was a strip of crimson silk. Gasps filled the room. Graves seized the letters triumphantly. "So, here is our proof at last." But Miss Marple, standing quietly near the hearth, studied the scene with narrowed eyes. Something was wrong. Too wrong. Blythe trembled, his face ashen. Yet in his expression there was not the look of a cold-blooded killer, but of a man cornered by secrets he had long wished to keep hidden. And Miss Marple, who had seen fear in many forms, knew the difference. This, she thought, is not the end. This is only the beginning of the unraveling.